And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
Is that The Clash? When was The Clash last played on CL, I wonder? Hey, and welcome to The Law Show. It's Zach Spencer here, and joining me in studio, Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher from MKS in downtown Vancouver. We're talking about citizenship and immigration, and we want to talk about the Citizenship Act. I guess this is the overarching sort of part of the law that you deal with every single day. So are there changes afoot? Is there something coming down? What's going on with the Citizenship Act?
Well, actually, the Citizenship Act was changed recently in the last year, and it's going to be changed again. The current minister has announced they're going to take a second look at the changes that were brought in by the Conservative government and move the citizenship back in certain areas.
And can you give me an example of that?
Well, there's certain areas that are well known to some people in the press and other areas that are less well known. But I think the most significant one is the ability to strip citizenship from individuals convicted of terrorism offenses.
Well, I remember Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister now, in the campaign was a citizen is a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian.
Yep.
So there was a recent story of the Toronto 18, one of the convicted in the Toronto 18, they wanted to blow up the CN Tower, and his citizenship was stripped. So people are saying, well, this is somebody who's convicted of a potential terrorist act. Do you really want them to be a Canadian again? So that's the question.
That is indeed the question, and that's the question that the Liberals are taking the position on, saying that there should only be one citizenship, that there's no second-class citizens, and other people take the position that in this world, there are situations where you should lose your citizenship.
I mean, if you take a look at the election, so this became a key election issue. If there were 3 or 4 key immigration issues that came up that I think sort of actually cost the Conservatives, the election. And one of them was this issue about a second-class citizenship. And to tell you how it plays out, I mean, and the term that Harper used, I think, which cost him, was the old stock Canadian. Right? So what you set up when you set up this provision that if you have citizenship somewhere else, not even only if you have citizenship, but if you actually have a potential right to citizenship from anywhere else, and you're then convicted of a terrorist act, right, in Canada or abroad, you're convicted of terrorism, they can then move to strip your Canadian citizenship. So this means for old stock Canadians, to use Harper's term, is this doesn't really affect them. But for somebody, for example, who may have been here for generations, take a Jewish individual who has a right to Israeli citizenship potentially, has never claimed it. So that individual, if his son is convicted of a crime, right, of terrorist act, then it's potential that his son, who has lived here for generations, it could be argued, has a right to Israeli citizenship, should be deported back to Israel despite having lived here for generations. So to give you an example where I saw it play out during the election, my child plays hockey with a gentleman who is originally from Pakistan, he's the CEO and president of an IT company, doing very well, and he was a Liberal supporter. And I asked him, I said, why are you a Liberal supporter? You're sort of that 1% that you think would be sort of, supporting the Conservatives. He goes, I had a Conservative guy ask me, why aren't you supporting Harper? Business is important, and, lower taxes and everything else for the business class, if you want to call it that. And he said, the problem I have is my son, has a right to Pakistani citizenship. And if my son is convicted of a terrorist act, he gets sent back to Pakistan, where he's never lived, doesn't speak Urdu, and has very little connection to. But if your son, speaking to an old stock Canadian, gets convicted of the exact same crime, your son gets to stay in Canada. And he said, the response from the old stock Canadian was, yeah, but it's expensive to keep these terrorists in jail if they're convicted. And my client's response, not my client, my friend's response, to look back and said, yeah, but it's expensive to keep your son in jail too, right? So why should, where I came from originally matter? If we're saying, you're a citizen, I think people look at citizenship for foreigners that come to this country, work hard, pay their taxes, want to be included. The thought is that once I'm a Canadian citizen, I'm part of the family. And we don't look at the past and say, listen, a generation ago, you were somewhere else, and therefore we're sending you back. And I think that's sat very poorly with, if you take a look at permanent residents now, foreign born in Canada is about almost 19% of the population, right? That's a large segment. And that segment, when they saw that, they saw, you know what, those conservatives really aren't on board with understanding what it means to have come from somewhere else and thinking that you belong when we're saying you don't.
Well, let's take out the terrorism aspect of this. So there are people who would say that, there's certainly been a large number of people who have Canadian citizenship but have a passport of convenience. They have nothing really to do with Canada. They live somewhere else, and they're using it as an escape valve if something doesn't work well in other parts of the world to come back to Canada. So they're a Canadian citizen. Now, they're not going to be convicted of anything like terrorism, but they're using the system to make sure they have a back door if they need it, right? You talk about lots of Canadian citizens have moved back to Hong Kong.
Oh, there's something like 200,000 Canadian citizens living in Hong Kong that have maybe very weak connections to Canada. I mean, that's clearly an issue, but I don't know if the way to deal with that is to strip them of citizenship, right?
Once you start that process, and this is the problem with so-called second-class citizens. Once you start that process of saying, for you, we can reduce your citizenship or remove it given this, this, or this, it becomes a slippery slope. This bill talks about terrorism.
Yeah.
The next bill might talk about residence. The next bill might talk about, ins and outs of Canada, etc. So, you're going to develop second-class citizens and a panoply of circumstances where citizenship can be taken away. That's a very difficult system to keep track of and to control. The other side of it is that under the bill as it was passed by the Conservatives, it wasn't a court that took away your citizenship. It was a ministerial and officer process, and there wasn't a right of appeal to it. And there was a lack of appeal process, and so and a lack of safeguards. So people were very concerned about this.
So this is a discretionary decision, and it's not gone through a judicial process. So you have appeal, right?
Exactly,
right?
And so it would have been bogged down in litigation for years. So the simpler answer is to say, just have one class of citizenship and treat people. If you're going to get involved in terrorism, then you're going to face the penalty of the law, but not necessarily one penalty for a certain group of citizens and a different penalty for another group of citizens.
Well, you could argue on the other side that we'll take the terrorism out of it again. For your permanent resident card, you have to spend a certain amount of time in the country over 5 years. Is it 2 years?
2 years out of 5, 730 days.
Yeah, a cumulative number. And why couldn't you apply that for citizens? I'll give you a perfect example. You run into somebody and they've been living in California for 30 years and they're coming back to Canada. They're a Canadian citizen. They haven't committed any resources to our tax base for those 30 years, but they want to get their health care. So I guess
but health care is not a federal issue. Health care is a provincial issue. Every province has its own rules. I have a friend who's a Canadian citizen who lives outside of Canada, but he comes back to Alberta to access the medical system, and he can. Other people cannot do that if they don't live in Alberta. If you live in BC, you got a different set of rules.
Right. I don't think we want to. We are very proud of our Canadians that go abroad, right? Michael Adon, if you take a look at Ignatieff, went to Harvard, teaching in Harvard. Would you want to say to that gentleman, you can't come back to Canada? We're going to strip you of your citizenship because you've been working at Harvard. We export Canadians. Canadians, go abroad a lot to work, right? To work for business, to find businesses, to find economic opportunities. And we're going to say to those people, no, you can't do that. The problem that it's an interesting thing because what they've repealed on this too is the Conservatives brought in an intent provision. So there was never an intent provision. So when my clients they could, and I'll give personal stories. So, when we had a lot of people coming from Hong Kong, their intention was probably after 3 years, they'd qualify for citizenship, to apply the day that they qualified, file the application, and the next day leave. But they'd met their 3 years here, and they did what the Act required. Right? The problem is they're no longer staying in Canada. They'd fly back for their citizenship, get sworn in, and leave again, and they don't know when they're coming in.
A lot of people have a problem with that.
So my question is, why is that citizen, who is now a Canadian citizen, can't go back and work on a business, but we have somebody who's born in Canada, and we can say, you can go find a business in China and go, Ivanhoe Mines, you're the head of Ivanhoe Mines, go to Mongolia, find a mine there, work on it, and spend as much time with it, and you're still a citizen. But you, who unfortunately was, not born here, but came here when you were 3 years old and been here for 17 years, went to UBC, you can't go? Makes no sense, right? Why would we want to limit our people once we give them that right that they're fighting for? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you want to make the term longer that you have to be here to qualify, That makes sense to me. But do the requirements at the front end, not at the back end, right? Because it becomes people plan their lives about, well, I'm a citizen.
But you can see the frustration.
Oh,
though.
My friends think I'm nuts. Like when I tell them about the terrorists, they're like, why wouldn't you want that guy deported? Why would you want him in Canada? Most people, I think you have to try and put yourself in someone else's shoes and saying, I wasn't born here. What does that feel like? I mean, both Gordon's father came from England. Both my parents, my dad came as steerage on a boat. I mean, we both we come from that perspective. I think we can appreciate a little bit more, and it's hard sometimes for Canadians to understand. You're trying to fit in, and yet even you make citizenship, you don't fit in. You're not 100%.
Well, I think it's an ethnic thing too. I mean, if you're Anglo and you're white, you fit in. That's part of the old stock argument that people took against Harper.
Well, and that's been a slow progression. If we want to talk about something else, we hadn't planned to talk today. So in 1976, they started changing who was criminally inadmissible. So before 76, what the Immigration Act said, if you were convicted of treason, if you were convicted of murder, if you were convicted of rape, most of those crimes you'd probably get killed for anyway, you could be deported, right? So you'd lose your permanent residency and you'd be deported out of Canada. After 76, when we saw a lot of Jamaicans immigrating, right? They changed the act to increase it that if you convicted what we considered a serious crime, you could get deported. And the Harper government went so far now as that if you're convicted of a crime in Canada where you spend 6 months in jail, you can be deported without any appeal. So we've gone to the point where we had mostly all white immigration, where basically you had to murder somebody to get deported. And now where we've opened up immigration to people from different parts of the world, our immigration policy has come to the point where if you spend 6 months in jail, you're getting deported without any appeal. To me, it smacks of a bit of racism.
Right. Well, it's a good conversation starter at the old cocktail party.
A little extreme.
All right, we are just getting warmed up, as you can tell. It's going to be an interesting show today. The Law Show here on CL 650. We're talking about immigration law. Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher are here with me. We're going to pick it up. We're going to talk about employer compliance. I guess this is a big part of your firm's work. Working with companies, having people coming back and forth across the border, family class. We're going to talk about a whole bunch more when we return next here on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.